proved to the establishment that the concentration camp technique, the reversion to the second dimension of fascism, the terrorist phase, but to prove that this terrorism won't work on us, it won't stop our movement.
This is the BGF oath. Weusi Gaidi Jama, that means Black Guerrilla Family. If I should break my stride or falter at my comrade's side, this oath shall kill me. If my words should prove untrue, should I betray the chosen few, this oath shall kill me. Should I submit to greed or lust, should I betray the people's trust, this oath shall kill me. Should I grow lax in discipline, in time of strife refuse my hand, this oath shall kill me. Should I fear any man or be slow to take a stand, this oath shall kill me. Long live the spirit of George Lester Jackson and the guerrillas of Black August, Weusi Gaidi Jama.
Greetings and salutations. Once again, it's your host, Gabe Morales. We've been covering Black Guerrilla family members and associates over the past 6 decades or so. Today, I'm going to cover a few K through L last names and then get into the M last names. I'll start off first with an individual that I recall as being named Kernard. If anybody out there knows who I'm talking about, I remember him being an old BGF guy back in the late 1980s. And he had complained to me that he had been so loyal to the family and he couldn't understand why those guys stabbed him. He would have did anything for them. He very much was proud of being black. It was a story I heard again and again from former prison gang members on how they had been betrayed by their organizations. So I would never forget that, and never forget that that happens with non-prison gang members too. Remember, the only ones probably going to be loyal to you will be your family, God, and hopefully you'll be true to yourself. I'll briefly mention that Big George Kirkpatrick, B number 34503, who was listed on old California Gang Task Force documents as being a leader at Soledad back in the 1970s. I also show that they had documented a Lionel Lee, B number as in Bravo, 6361, as being very dangerous to staff at Soledad in the 1970s. There was George Big Jake Lewis, who is said to be a lifer, described in James Carr's book Bad, as well as George Jackson, as he was close to both of them. Big Jake, like his name, was said to be very big and very strong and very brave. It was he who was said to have given James Carr a shank during the time period when they were under attack by the Mexican Mafia, and Big Jake told him, "Here, take this, defend yourself," as James Carr and George Jackson often controlled the gambling rackets on the yard. It is also said that Big Jake was very vocal when a pre-Aryan Brotherhood group called Hitler's Helpers were messing with blacks. It is said that Big Jake led the revolt against them and the guards, who were said to have favored the whites. It is also said it was Big Jake who first gave George Jackson a revolutionary pamphlet on the Communist Manifesto. While him and Carr were still in their criminal mentality, this book and other revolutionary books later affected George, who stated that he met Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, Engels, and Mao when I entered prison, and they redeemed me. One source states that Big Jake was still around in 1971, aligned with George, and was considered to be a leader at that time. But I'm unsure what happened to him after that time period. If anybody knows, I'd be interested in knowing, because it sounds like he was a very influential character in the growth of the black family, which later became known as the BGF. There was Ruchell Cinque Magee, who got his moniker after a former slave named Joseph Cinque, who led a revolt on a Spanish slave ship called La Amistad in 1839. Magee spent most of his life in prison. He was born in Louisiana and at the age of 16 was convicted of attempted rape. He then was paroled in 1962 and moved out to Los Angeles. But about a year later, he was convicted of kidnapping and robbery. Because of his prior rape conviction, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Like McClain, he was also one of those involved in the August 1970 takeover of the Marin County Courthouse by Jonathan Jackson. You can see the William Bill Christmas C episode, as well as the introduction in Jonathan Jackson episodes for more information on that. but he was gravely wounded in that incident. Magee was later put on trial and convicted of being the one who held the shotgun taped to Judge Haley's head. According to Deputy Prosecutor Gary Thomas, who was one of the hostages, he testified that he saw Magee kill Haley and testified that Magee said, "Let's not take any of them. Let's kill them all here." But Magee's account was that Haley was killed by police bullets and dead before the shotgun went off. He was tried along with Angela Davis, who acknowledged she had purchased the guns, although, as I explained in the D episode, she was later found not guilty of having any knowledge or participation in the actual plan. Like I said, Magee was locked up most of his life, and after numerous outside prison rights organizations tried to get his release for many years, he was finally freed under California Assembly Bill 960, known as the Compassionate Release Law, that took place on January 2023, which allowed for Magee's final release from prison. But Magee died on October 17, 2023, only 81 days after his release. There was Jarvis, a.k.a. Left Hand, a.k.a. Masters, who had C number 35169. I show that Masters was admitted to CDC in September 1981. He ended up being housed at San Quentin's prison in Donner Section. Sergeant Hal Birchfield was killed June 8, 1985. An inmate, Andre Somo Johnson, was convicted in that death. And it was said that Masters, Lawrence Old Man Woodard, and Rufus Zulu, a.k.a. Achille Willis, were all members of the BGF and also named in that plot. Stated that Willis turned state's evidence, and that several weeks before Birchfield's death, Willis received a kite from a Willie Redmond, who was a BGF leader in the Carson section of the prison. At that point, Masters, Woodard, Willis, and Redmond allegedly met on the exercise yard to discuss killing Birchfield, who had been described by the BGF and many blacks as being a racist who favored the Aryan Brotherhood when they assaulted blacks. Evidently, the BGF that were present also met with members of the Crip gang to discuss their plans, in part as revenge for the death of one of their members named Montgomery, who was killed by a Mexican mafia member by the name of Daryl Castrillon from the Ontario Black Angels. Castrillon lost an eye during that attack and can be seen here with the patch over his eye. Montgomery was not killed by a white inmate, as I've heard by some sources. O.G. Frog from the Bounty Hunters in Nickerson Gardens has a slightly different version of what happened during that time period. He states that he had recently arrived at San Quentin from Soledad when Joe Valentine shot him a kite, telling him to have a CO stand between him and the bars due to the fact that Sergeant Hal Birchfield had recently been speared that way. He states that there were multiple black prison gangs there. He says it was well known who the hitter actually was and calls him a freedom fighter. He also states that in East Block, the BGF fighting versus a very small but aggressive contingent of vanguards, and that it became a war of blacks on blacks, with vanguards aligned with the Crips and some Bloods aligned with BGF, and that there were about 7 Bloods and 10 BGF who were aligned at the time. Donner unit had open cell bars with multiple cells on each tier, stacked several tiers high, and Birchfield worked the graveyard shift and walked the tier during count when evidently he was killed by a single chest wound from a spear that was aimed at him through the bars. A sharpened piece of metal was found on the second tier near Johnson's cell by staff as they responded after the alarm. In addition to the shank, staff found what appeared to be a homemade spear made out of tightly rolled up newspaper, and Johnson later admitted to Willis that he tore the metal shank off the tip of the spear and chucked it before officers could arrive to conduct a search. Medical attention was called for Sergeant Birchfield, but eventually died from his wound. As described in the E episode, inmate Bobby Evans also agreed to testify for the state. Previously, he mentioned that he was an enforcer on the BGF Central Committee, and that approximately 1 month after Birchfield's death, he was transferred to the San Quentin Adjustment Center, where Masters, Johnson, and Woodard were sent as a result of the murder investigation. During this trial, Masters also testified that Willis considered himself to be a member of the Crips and sought revenge on the BGF after they killed one of his friends. You have to understand that the BGF does have some Crip and some Blood members, but most Crips and Bloods in prison did not like the BGF bossing them around, and their attempts to recruit Crips and Bloods is one of the big reasons why they failed. They had a little more success with the 4 and 5 until many of the Kumi also brushed them off, as all 3 younger groups were not really interested in the revolution. They were interested in making money. Willis's own cousin was also housed at San Quentin in 1984 and testified that Willis wanted to leave the BGF to form his own Crip hit squad. And he also mentioned that Willis was very manipulative. As stated before, Evans' motives for testifying for the prosecution were challenged by the defense at the trial, and his testimony was considered to be sketchy, as he had a very poor reputation. Both Evans and Willis had been told they might get immunity for their testimony in the case. Inmate Harold Richardson, who had several family members in the BGF, reportedly confessed his role in the Birchville murder in a written memo. I'm pretty sure I had one of the Richardsons on my yard at New Folsom. As I recall, they were out of the Riverside area. Somebody let me know if I'm correct. Before the trial, Masters tried to sever his case from Johnson and Woodard's on grounds that he intended to introduce written statements on Richardson, who was quoted as being directly involved in the murder plot. Masters also alleged that Richardson had stated Birchville's murder was pinned on somebody else. Masters claimed that a BGF member named Charles Doom wrote a letter to the Marin County clerk stating that he had information on Birchville's murder and that he was head of security from Carson section when it happened. But Masters' motion was denied as inadmissible. Masters was also suspect in a 1984 murder on the San Quentin exercise yard after inmate David Jackson was killed by a shank to the neck. An officer later stated that he saw Jackson walk towards Masters, look away, and then looked again as Jackson staggered away from Masters and a group of black inmates that Masters was standing with. It was because of that incident that Masters was transferred to the adjustment center. Masters allegedly admitted to an inmate Johnny Hose, BGF security chief for the AC, that he was sent there for killing Jackson. Hose also testified that he dropped out of the BGF after Birchville's death, and because Masters threatened to kill him and his entire family. Murder crime scene photos of Jackson were shown by the prosecution during Masters' trial, and he stated this introduced evidence was prejudicial during the appeal of his case. Evidently, Masters changed his story several times, but always denied killing Jackson. He did admit to having confrontation with LA County jail officers while housed there, and while there was charged with several write-ups for possession of inmate-manufactured weapons. Masters was ultimately convicted of the murder of Sergeant Birchfield and appealed his case to the Supreme Court in 2016. Masters has continued to profess his innocence, and in 2009 wrote a book called That Bird Has My Wings, which made Oprah's book club. In it, he talks about his time on death row, growing up in a dysfunctional family, and eventually embracing Buddhism. When Governor Newsom shut down San Quentin, Masters was sent to the Sierra Conservation Center, where he currently resides. There was James David McClain, who was born in Texas and is said to have graduated school with a 5th grade reading and writing level. It stated that McClain first ran into problems with the law in 1954 when he was arrested by El Paso police. A year later, he was said to have been arrested in Wichita, Kansas for larceny, and he had other arrests. He finally relocated to California and was soon arrested for robbery out of San Joaquin County. He then was sent to San Quentin prison in 1962, paroled in 1967, but soon returned on a parole violation. He was released again, but soon returned in 1969 for assault on an Oakland police officer. McClain was one of those individuals killed in the Marin County courthouse shooting where Jonathan Jackson took it over and took hostages. Briefly mention a Ulysses McDaniel, who I understand was fairly close to the Sudanese Liberation Army. He was born in L.A. in 1937 and by 1958 had been convicted of a car theft, whereby he received 6 months to 5 years. He then was processed at CIM Reception Center and assigned prison number A as in Alpha, 64486. From Chino then, he was sent off to San Quentin. It is my understanding that in the early 60s, he met George Jackson and was celled up with him. I have information that he was given another charge for assaulting an Aryan Nazi inmate who was involved in the death of a black Muslim in San Quentin. For that assault, McDaniel picked up an indeterminate sentencing between 5 years to life in 1964. He then was moved to Folsom Prison and was considered to be a high-risk prisoner. He was housed at 4A, which is the security housing unit, for most of his time at Folsom. It was there, I believe, around 1973 that he took the BGF oath, seen here. He also penned a poem that I don't have but would love to see called Ode to the Gorilla. Evidently, McDaniel became terminally ill and they sent him to Vacaville for an operation, but he refused to be put underneath anesthesia, believing that he would be killed by authorities. It's my understanding then he went into a non-traditional health diet and fitness program and eventually was released from prison and moved to Palo Alto, where he remained involved in left-wing radical movements. I'll briefly mention an individual named Ed Meade, who was a key leader in the revolutionary group called the George Jackson Brigade in the mid-1970s that was based in Seattle, Washington. This group was very diverse, consisting of both communists and anarchists. And I would say that the majority of them were white leftists, although there was blacks in it, such as Ed's good friend Mark Cook. It's my understanding that Ed Meade traveled to San Francisco in 1974, shortly after his release from prison for a burglary, and was hoping to connect with the Sudanese Liberation Army that I've mentioned several times before, which was made famous for kidnapping Patty Hearst and brainwashing her, where she became Revolutionary Comrade Tanya and participated in bank robberies with them. However, that did not work out, and he ended up joining the New World Liberation Front, where he learned how to make pipe bombs. He then returned to Seattle, where he began to form a communist cell, and they named themselves the George Jackson Brigade based on the promise that they would hunt his oppressors after death. Ed Meade was arrested in January 1976 after attempted bank robbery in Tequila, and was incarcerated for many years at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, where he remained very involved in leftist politics. He finally was released from prison in 1993. Meade was also very involved in organizing the hunger strikes that started around the year 2013 in the California system, and he participated in multiple protests around the country, including at the King County Jail, and died in November of 2023. Like I said, the George Jackson had an alliance with the Sudanese Liberation Army, as well as the Black Guerrilla family, and via Bill and Emily Harris, helped the Wellspring Communion, which was another leftist group that participated in a bloody escape from the King County Jail on October 14, 1979. I actually spoke to some of the guards that were held hostage during that incident. The brigade also had ties to the leftist group, the Weather Underground. For my book, I interviewed with Seattle Police Detective Jim Diamond Sr., and he told me that his partner and George Johnson were working in plain clothes, doing surveillance on the group when they saw Poe blow himself up at the Safeway store on 15th in the famous Capitol Hill neighborhood, near the same area that famed grunge Nirvana band singer Kurt Cobain would later cop as heroin. Evidently, Poe was placing a bomb in the vent of the store when the fuse shorted and the bomb blew up. He also was involved in a case on another bomb threat on a store from the brigade that was traced to a tavern, also located on Capitol Hill, about a half mile from the previous incident. And he went undercover to have some drinks and play pool, and was standing next to the payphone when a female walked up to the phone, called 911, and made another bomb threat. Pretty easy case then. He grabbed her and then handcuffed her and called for backup. But he said backup didn't arrive for about 5 minutes, and he was kind of worried that there would be more George Jackson Brigade members who come to rescue her and possibly kill him. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about Angelo Melendez. Angelo Melendez was arrested and housed at the King County Jail shortly after I started working classification, which, as I explained in previous episodes, basically interviews inmates to assess their security level for appropriate placement. And as I was interviewing him, I found out that he had done some serious time in California. I then asked if he had any tattoos, and he was a little hesitant at first, but said yes. I then asked if he could show me, and he showed me these tattoos right here, which immediately I recognized as being the Black Guerrilla family dragon symbol. But what surprised me was he also had a Kumi 415 on the other side of his back. So as I stated before, I've encountered BGF members that are cool with Kumi and Kumi that are cool with BGF, but I don't think I've ever seen anybody that had both of them on him. As I recall, Angelo Melendez was out of Stockton and had a fugitive warrant and was soon sent back to California. There's a couple individuals that I mentioned under the W.L. Nolan Soledad incident that happened on January 13th, 1970, that also have M last names. And that was Thomas Menweather and Alvin Jug Miller. To BGF members, W.L. Nolan was viewed as being a troublemaker, stirring up fellow black prisoners. And on November 12th, 1969, staff began a crackdown, shaking down inmates and supposedly roughed up W.L. Nolan. The next day, inmates Thomas Mayweather, Cleveland Edwards, and Hugo Pinnell retaliated against the guards by throwing feces and urine mixed in a cup at guards, commonly known as gassing. Prison guards in return fired tear gas into their cells. On the morning of January 13, 1970, around 0900 hours, convicts were let out of their cells to go to the exercise yard. That day, guard O.P.G. Miller was assigned the yard gunner position. Miller was known to be a marksman. The following black prisoners were released to yard: W.L. Nolan, Thomas Menweather, Eddie Whiteside, Earl Satcher, John Randolph, Alvin Jug Miller, and Cleveland Edwards. Also at the same time, released were Aryan Brotherhood members Howard Smiley Hole, Richard Cactus Ferguson, Eric Hawaiian John Fanning, who was actually a Samoan, Billy Buzzard Harris, Ronnie Harper, and Robert Chuka Wendiker, who was half Hawaiian and half German. Black inmates then gathered around the north end of the yard, near the handball court. Inmates Thomas Menweather and John Randolph proceeded to play handball, while the other black prisoners were working out and engaged in conversation. The whites converged at the center of the yard, and it was at that time period that Chuka Wendiker walked over where Nolan and Mayweather were standing. As W.L. Nolan saw Wendiker approaching, he punched him in the head, which set off brawls between the Aryan Brotherhood and black prisoners. Wendiker, knowing that W.L. Nolan was a champion boxer, decided to tackle him, when O.P. Miller fired at them both, killing W.L. Nolan. Inmate Thomas Menweather then ran towards Wendiker, but was jumped by Buzzard Harris and Harper. Cleveland Edwards then ran towards Nolan, trying to assist him as he was bleeding to death. Then, according to reports, O.P. Miller fired fatal shots, killing Cleveland Edwards and Jug Miller. There were 3 shots in total, all 3 of them fatal. Alfred Edward Moffett, who was a very influential BGF member in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, under number 99747-011. While he was in BOP custody, he communicated with numerous BGF in the federal system, in California, and out in the streets. He then was sent to CDC and given a number as in Apple, C as in Charlie, 4956, and was housed at San Quentin around the year 2011, but I sure currently is not in custody in the BOP or CDC. Alfred Akili Moffett is currently 71 years old. And that's all I have for the K through M last names. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that you learned something new once again. Thank you for supporting this channel. Don't forget to tell your friends about it and share this episode with them if you think they might be interested. Hope you have a great day and stay blessed. For now, this is Gabe Morales signing off for Gangsters, Cops, and Politicians.
Should I go lax and discipline? The time of strife refuse my hand, this also kill me. Should I fear any man or be slow to take a stand, this also kill me. Long live the spirit of George Lester Jackson and the gorillas of Black August, Weusi Gaidi Jama.